that opening statement, Douglas. It's now Mehdi Hasan's opportunity to present the con side of the argument.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. In 1917, over 100 years ago, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, a card-carrying anti-Semite, a man who had denounced the evils of Jewish immigration into the UK, a man who referred to Jews as an alien and hostile people, he issued his Balfour Declaration, which promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was the first time a major world power had come out in favor of Zionism, which at the time was a pretty new and pretty controversial movement, calling not just for a Jewish homeland, but for the building of a Jewish majority state in Palestine. And yet, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet at that time, a man named Edwin Samuel Montagu, adamantly opposed both Zionism, which he called a mischievous political creed, and the Balfour Declaration, which he referred to as anti-Semitic and a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. The only Jewish member of the British cabinet, that is what he said. And yet, tonight here in Toronto, over 100 years later, we are being asked to vote for a motion that would damn Montagu as the anti-Semite while praising Balfour as the champion of Jews and Judaism. That's ridiculous. In fact, this entire motion tonight is ridiculous, disingenuous, ahistorical. It says, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It doesn't say some anti-Zionists engage in anti-Semitism, which I don't disagree with. It doesn't say some anti-Semites hide behind the cloak of anti-Zionism, which again, I don't disagree with. Everything Douglas listed about what's happened in Toronto, disgusting, reprehensible. Those people are shameless bigots. But that's not what the motion says. The motion says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. No ifs, no buts, no caveats, no exceptions. Anyone who takes an anti-Zionist position is automatically, inherently, unavoidably anti-Jewish, an anti-Semite, a racist. That is what you would be voting for if you make the mistake of voting for this motion tonight, which I'm sure you won't do because you are far too smart and nuanced an audience to do that. You are Canadians! And I have great respect for Canadians. I say that for no apparent reason whatsoever. I like Canadians. I like Israelis. My debate partner tonight, Gideon Levy, Israeli writer, is one of my journalistic heroes. It's a privilege to be on the stage with him. But this debate fundamentally at its core, and I kind of agree with Douglas here, it's not about Israelis. It's not about Israel. It's not about Gaza. And by the way, on the subject of Gaza, given Douglas gave us some math about the death toll on October the 7th, horrific death toll, which we all condemn, I would remind you also that the death toll inflicted on Gaza, the deaths and injuries in Gaza are the equivalent, if we're going to do the ratios, of 2 million Canadians. 2 million Canadians. But that's not what the debate is about. It's not even about Zionism itself. It's about the legitimacy of anti-Zionism, whether you can be anti-Zionist, opposed to Zionism, which remember is a political ideology, a nationalist movement, not a religion, not a race, not a protected class, whether you can be anti-Zionist without being smeared, tarred, demonized as an anti-Semite. And I want to be clear tonight. You could be the most pro-Israeli person in this room tonight, the most proud and ardent Zionist here, and still vote against this motion with a clear conscience. Still vote with our side, the right side. Because this motion is not about whether you are pro-Israel or pro-Zionist. It's about whether the rest of us have the right, the freedom to take a different view on Israel, on Zionism, on Benjamin Netanyahu even, without being silenced, without being told we're racists. We're not. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I'll tell you 3 reasons why. 3 reasons why you should oppose this motion tonight. Number 1, if you vote for this motion tonight, you are throwing logic, history, and the English language under the bus. Because anti-Semitism is hating Jews, the people, and Judaism, the religion. Anti-Zionism is opposing Israel, the state, and Zionism, the ethno-nationalist ideology that underpins that state. Zionism is not Judaism. Let me say that again for the people up top. Zionism is not Judaism. Right? It's a very modern, secular, political ideology, movement that was founded less than 150 years ago by an atheist named Theodore Herzl, who said, and I quote, "The anti-Semites will be our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries, our allies." His words, not mine. Number 2, if you vote for this motion, you're throwing Palestinians as a people under the bus. You're telling an occupied people, a dispossessed people, to accept their own occupation, their own dispossession, meekly, in silence. Otherwise, they're racists. As my friend Yusuf Manaya, the Palestinian-American activist, says, to ask Palestinians not to be anti-Zionist is to ask Palestinians not to be. And number 3, last but not least, if you vote for this motion, you're throwing a lot of Jews under the bus as well. Not just Jews like Edwin Samuel Montagu, but Jews today. If you vote for this motion tonight, you're saying my debate partner, Gideon Levy, whose grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, who served for Shimon Peres, who's written for Haaretz for over 40 years, just won Israel's top journalism prize 3 years ago, he's an anti-Semite. You're saying the Satmar, the world's biggest Hasidic Jewish sect, which says it is fighting God's war against Zionism, is anti-Semitic. You're saying Jewish college students on campus, maybe some of them are your kids, members of If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, they're anti-Semites. You're saying some of the most respected Jewish voices in the world, like Abraham Berg, the former Speaker of the Parliament, Miriam Margolis, the actress from Harry Bloody Potter, they're all anti-Semites. That is what you're saying. That is what you're signing off on if you vote for this motion tonight. So I have a simple solution for you all. Don't do it. Vote instead for common sense, for free speech, and the right to criticize a foreign country, the right to criticize a foreign country and a political ideology. I beg to oppose.
Your opportunity for rebuttal, 3 minutes on the clock.
Thank you very much. Oof. Oof. I love the fact that Natasha started the speech by saying, our side cannot define Zionism, anti-Zionism, or anti-Semitism. So Gideon, you and I should just go check out the CN Tower, because I'm not sure what the debate's about. We're being told by the proposition that we must follow their definitions of what we're here to argue and vote about, which tells you how authoritarian that side of the motion. This debate for me tonight is fascinating because for years Douglas has been the free speech warrior and I've been the guy saying there's no right to absolute free speech. Tonight I feel the roles are reversed. I'm here to say, what happened to free speech? What happened to the ability to criticize others, governments, countries, yes, political ideologies, Natasha. Theodore Herzl would be surprised to hear you say it wasn't a political ideology or a national movement. And I just find it fascinating that Natasha made it very clear that non-Jews cannot define anything to do with this. And then Douglas stepped up and accused every Jewish protester against Israel of being an anti-Semite, which I find offensive and ridiculous. Thousands upon thousands of Jews. You don't have to agree with them, remember, you don't have to agree with them. But they took their right to go out on the streets in Toronto, in DC, in New York, in London, in Paris, all over the world, in Tel Aviv, to protest against what's happening in Gaza. And Douglas, one of the world's most proud atheists, not Jewish as far as I know, just damned them all as anti-Semites. Wow, that speaks volumes about where this debate is going and who is defining what and how. As for Natasha's line and Douglas's line that if you don't support self-determination for a particular group, you're a bigot, well, you know, we've already had a lot of votes, so I won't ask you to click. I don't have power over your clickers, but I'd love to know how many people in this room either were in the last Quebec referendum or supported it from afar, because we're in Canada, where a bunch of people want to leave Canada and do their own thing, and I'm sure many people in this room legitimately oppose that, and no one says you're bigots towards the people of Quebec. Nobody says you're anti-French language. You're allowed to have a debate about whether Canada includes Quebec or not. And you know, my friend Peter Beinart, who is Jewish, just so Douglas will call him an anti-Semite later, as he pointed out, the Basques, the Catalans, the Kurds, the Scots, they don't have states. And if you oppose them having states, you're not an anti-Kurd bigot, you're not an anti-Scot bigot, you're not an anti-Catalan bigot. People have arguments all the time. There are 5,000 indigenous groups in the world today. According to the UN, there are 193 member states of the UN. You do the math, right? So this is a ridiculous disargument that we are being expected to believe that if you don't support Israel as it is currently constituted, with Jewish supremacy, as Gideon points out, that makes you an anti-Semite. It's an abuse of anti-Semitism. It empties at a very important concept, at a very urgent time of all meaning, in order to defend a country which, as Gideon has pointed out, and which Douglas seems to think is fine, has killed tens of thousands of innocent people in recent months.
Let's reset that clock, and Natasha Hausdorff will have your rebuttal now.
Thank you. I'd like to use my time to do some fact-checking, but I only have 3 minutes, so we'll see how far I get. But first of all, Balfour. We heard him quoted to you earlier, ladies and gentlemen. Well, let's be clear about that quote and what was changed, or at least misrepresented, because I think this is going to give a really strong indication for what is coming out of the opposition as a whole. We were told he'd referred to Jews as alien and hostile. In fact, that he was therefore an anti-Semite. Well, I'm going to read you out the quote and you make up your own minds. He said, "Mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or absorb." So I encourage you very strongly not to take for granted what the opposition are telling you tonight. And now we come to look at the numbers, and we've heard 37 and 38,000 quoted at you already this evening, and we've only just started. Ladies and gentlemen, would members of the opposition be quoting figures from Al-Qaeda or ISIS in the way that they are quoting Hamas propaganda here this evening? These figures, which have not been verified, and which even the UN has revised down on the basis of missing information for significant thousands of these figures that have come from quote-unquote media sources as opposed to from hospitals, and that have been circulated on Google Docs where people are encouraged to enter their martyrs here. This is the methodology for compiling these supposed figures. But even if we look past that and all of the studies that have already debunked these as significantly fabricated and invented, these figures make no distinction between civilians or combatants. They do not tell you how these people have died. We know that Hamas are shooting their own civilians. We know that they are bombing fleeing civilians. We know that when Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip, they kill indiscriminately, unlike the measures that Israel takes, which are targeted, precise, and based on proportionality exercises. I mentioned that Israel takes more measures than any other army in the history of war to prevent civilian casualties. Hamas's main aim here is to drive up that casualty figure and inflate it, if necessary, in order to seek to win this war through creating international pressure. And it is inextricably linked with what we are discussing here tonight, because their mechanism for doing so is not just the lies about the origins of anti-Semitism or whether Balfour was an anti-Semite, but also significantly about what is happening on the ground. That is anti-Zionism, and it is double standard against the Jewish state, which means that we know that it is anti-Semitism too.
Gideon, we're going to save the best for last. Let's have your rebuttal now.
I really feel overdose of propaganda, and it really neutralized me in a way, but I'll try to manage just on a factual ground, because you were all kind enough to applaud to what Douglas said, that if only Hamas will release the hostages, the war will come to its end. From time to time, it's also good to stick to facts. And the fact is that Israel wants to continue this war with the hostages or without them. And Israel is not ready to get a deal because Israel does not want to end this war. So with all the respect, things must be more accurate than this. But I would like to speak about something which is more principled. One of the big fears that we are being taught day and night is that they all want to exterminate Israel. That if you call from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, it means to send all the Jews back to Auschwitz. It is a fight over the regime between the river and the sea. Nobody who opposed apartheid in South Africa spoke about exterminating South Africa. We were speaking, or they were speaking, about changing the regime. Between the river and the sea, today there are two peoples living together under the same rule, half and half by size. There's only one thing lacking there, and this is equality. This small value which democracy cannot exist without it. And when there is no democracy, it looks like apartheid, it behaves like apartheid, and it is apartheid. Zionism stands behind it, and in order to create this new regime that we all should have been in favor of a real democracy between the river and the sea, Israel has to give up one of two, either being a Jewish state or being a democratic state. As long as there are two peoples, it cannot be Jewish. As long as there is Jewish supremacy, it cannot be democratic. So it's all about changing the regime. And yes, between the river and the sea, I would love to see one day equality. And this is the meaning of releasing Palestine. And it has nothing to do, not with the Holocaust, not with Auschwitz, and not with many other things. Right now, our cause, and it should be the world's cause, is to changing the regime into a democracy. What is wrong in this? What is wrong in wishing for an equal society?
Okay, I'm going to join the debate now and try to think of some questions that are top of mind for our audience following this fantastic back and forth. Let's begin, and Douglas, let me come to you first, because I think it's certainly, no doubt, on many people's minds to address Gideon and Mehdi's point about what is legitimate in this debate in terms of the criticism of Zionism and what is illegitimate. Well, give us a sense of your parameters here, because they're making an argument that, you know, this is a debate. We are having a debate today, are we not? So is all of this off the table? What's on the table? Give us, calibrate for us your understanding of Zionism.
Let me just reiterate, because we started this debate with a definition put up behind us on the screens, and however much Mehdi and Gideon want to reframe it, it's quite straightforward. Zionism, I repeat, is the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland. Anti-Semitism is cruel double standards towards Jews and cruel and unfair treatment of them as Jews. When I mean, I wish I could say I'm amazed by what Gideon said, but I recently watched your interview on Al Jazeera where you said that when the interviewer said to you, how many people in Israel agree with you? And you said you could fit them in a phone box. And that's true. That is absolutely true. You are as obscure a figure in Israeli society as it's possible to find. And I'll give you an example of why. Natasha just picked Mehdi up on an important lie. You could say it's just an elision or a mistake he made because he hadn't read the primary sources, but I cannot allow Gideon to get away with what he just said, which was an unbelievable lie. He said, Israel isn't a democracy. First of all, I don't know, maybe, have you ever been there?
Yes.
When?
A few years ago, not recently. I don't get awards from the president of Israel like you do, so I don't get to do softball interviews with Netanyahu. I didn't get invited into Gaza.
If I were you,
let me finish my point. But you went to Gaza, right? You said you went to Gaza. How come you went to Gaza when the world's media is not allowed into Gaza?
There's two reasons.
But they took you into Gaza.
Well, first of all, I'll explain, but let me pick up my point since you keep trying to derail me. There are two ways to go into Gaza. One is with the IDF, which is what I did and what most Western journalists have done. The other is to go in with Hamas. You could probably go in with Hamas. I can't. Secondly,
through some of the questions that are on the mind of this audience who are going to have to vote on this resolution at the end of the evening. So, Mehdi, have a quick response, but then let's get focused back on this question of why do you think Zionism is a movement, a political, an ism like anti-Americanism or anti-Britishism or whatever it is? I want to hear more on that so this audience can make an informed choice at the end of the night.
Yes, but let me just deal with a few things that Douglas said, because there were a few things were said. I mean, it's amusing. I wasn't surprised at all. I came to a debate in Toronto to debate Israel with two defenders of the current government, and so far Gideon and I, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't call, we could have done a long list of you're apologists for genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity. We didn't do that, but we've been called liars and Hamas supporters, and I get it. Neither of us talked about Hamas. We don't support Hamas. This is not a debate about Hamas. I know Douglas wants to redefine it as a debate about Hamas. Great, good for him, because he can't actually deal with the arguments we're putting forward. All the Jews who are putting forward these arguments, they're all anti-Semites, remember. I just want to deal with one point very important here. Douglas is the great journalist in Israel. I love this. Cosplaying as a journalist, going into Gaza with the IDF. Douglas interviewed Benjamin Netanyahu in January. Douglas did not, you're very bothered by Qatar and funding Hamas.
They're your bosses.
But, well, we're talking about bosses, let's talk to this.
You're literally paid by them.
I've I've interviewed Qatari officials. You can go on YouTube and watch my interviews with Qatari officials. And then you can watch Douglas interview Benjamin Netanyahu, where he asked him pearls like, is there another chapter left in the Netanyahu biography? That was the strong question. He didn't ask Benjamin Netanyahu, why did you work with Qatar to fund Hamas all those years? Why did you prop up Hamas all those years? Why, according to today's Israeli media, did you have reports that there was going to be an attack on your citizens and completely allow that to happen? Douglas didn't ask any of those questions. Instead, he'd like to spray around Hamas at the Muslim on the stage. Douglas referred to Hamza Yusuf, the First Minister of Scotland recently, as the First Minister of Gaza. Muslim guy, and he said, quote, you said, quote, he has infiltrated our system. Given we're at a debate about anti-Semitism, I find it ironic that you are throwing out some of the most bigoted dual loyalty tropes known to man, referring to a born British Muslim politician as the First Minister of Gaza.
Since he's leveled that, I have to correct it. First of all, you obviously didn't see the whole interview of Netanyahu. You'd have seen the first question was one that no one else has asked him. But anyway.
Did you ask about his support for Qatar and hostages?
Gentlemen, we're going to reset.
Douglas, did you ask about
It's lovely to have the Douglas and Mehdi show, but we have two other presenters on this panel that our audience wants to hear from. Don't you want it? Mehdi, very briefly, because I've got a question for Douglas, very briefly.
I'll be as brief as everyone else. The proposition tonight, I've sprayed around the word lie and liar, so let's return the compliment. Natasha lied when she talked about UNRWA and terrorism. The UN set up an independent inquiry, asked the Israelis for evidence. I know you don't want to hear this. They asked the Israelis, she's parroting propaganda from the Israeli government. The Israeli government was asked to give evidence. They refused to give their evidence. Every Western government, including your own, Canada's, has restarted funding because they looked at the evidence and didn't see it. That's great. I get it. But as Douglas might have once said, facts don't care about your feelings. To come back to the other point of lie, Douglas says the war would end if Hamas gave back the hostages. Complete lie. The Israelis have said, even if the hostages come back, we carry on the war. In fact, I interviewed Avraham Munter's nephew. Avraham Munter is a 79-year-old Israeli hostage right now. Poor guy, tragic. 79-year-old in captivity, should be freed, of course, had to have his birthday in captivity. His nephew says that every time he goes on the streets, Ben Gvir's police beat him. They beat him and arrest him. They're arresting hostage members' families, hostages' family members. And they're coming on TV and saying, why are we being used as props by people who support the war? He doesn't support the war. He wants a deal. Israeli family members are going on the streets and being tear-gassed and water cannon or whatever, beaten by the police because they want a deal and they want an end to the war that Douglas and Natasha so proudly support. They keep telling us about the horrors of October the 7th. I agree. This side shares the revulsion against the horrors of October the 7th, but we also share revulsion against the horrors that came since October the 7th. We don't support those horrors. I'm opposed to the war crimes that happened on October the 7th and the war crimes that have happened since October the 7th. Douglas, no, I've got to finish this point. Douglas, the week after October the 7th, came out in The Spectator and advocated for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which is a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. He said now is
not true.
You said now is a good time to do it.
Everyone can read the piece other than Mehdi.
Rudyard, I'm going to ask to respond to that because it's clear Mehdi didn't listen to a single word that I said. I was talking.
And what they don't realize is that if they got what they wanted, they'd have finished the work of Adolf Hitler.
Something you thought a lot about too.
Douglas earlier was telling us all about the importance of journalism going on the ground. While Douglas was getting awards from the President of Israel, we were actually reporting, my news organization Zeteo, from those campuses with Jewish students. In fact, the most read piece on our site is from a student called Jonathan Ben Menachem, who is at Columbia and reported from inside the encampment where they were having a Seder, where he was protesting war crimes in Gaza, which I know the other side thinks there are no war crimes, everything we just imagined the last 8 months. What you have to tackle tonight, I'm glad we brought up college campuses, because again, if this ridiculous sweeping motion, Douglas says complexity, we are the side of complexity, we're not the ones saying anti-Zionism across the board is anti-Semitism, you have to deal with the fact that college protests are disproportionate. There are a disproportionate number of Jews in these protests. They're all brainwashed, they're all idiots, they're all self-haters. Some of the top academics at Columbia University who are Jewish have come out to defend the protests. Annalise Orlek is a 65-year-old former chair of Jewish studies at Dartmouth. She was beaten on camera by police while she was protesting against the war in Gaza. Apparently Douglas, an atheist, says that she's an anti-Semite. That's the debate, that's what we've got to tonight, where the former chair of Jewish studies at Dartmouth is an anti-Semite, while Douglas is the champion of the Jewish people. I find it bizarre, and I'm glad we've brought up college protests because it's the number one evidence right now in our discourse that actually a lot of young Jewish people, and by the way, this whole argument, why didn't you protest Sudan? Why didn't you protest Syria? Last time I checked, the United States Congress does not fund Bashar al-Assad or the RSF militias in Sudan. So stop with this lazy whataboutism that gives you...
They do fund your friends in Tehran.
The US Congress funds Tehran.
You know very well Biden's package for Tehran.
What?
You don't know about it?
US funds Iran. Okay, you got me there, Douglas.
Wow.
By the way, since we're doing fact checks,
since Biden decided to bring Iran back into JCPOA, they are no longer under the sanctions that they were, and have been brought back into the fold. Ergo, they end up with international funding.
America is funding Iran like it funds Israel. This is absurd. By the way, just on fact checks, Natasha gave us a lecture about she's the lawyer on stage. That's true, you are the lawyer on stage. But literally, the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has asked for arrest warrants. And you're booing again. I know you don't like it, but by the way, the advisor to the ICC chief prosecutor is a man named Theodore Meron, 94 years old, Holocaust survivor, former advisor to the Israeli foreign minister. He advised the ICC to ask for arrest warrants. But according to Douglas and Natasha tonight, and many of you, he's an anti-Semite too. Theodore Meron's an anti-Semite. Let's just keep the list going tonight till we vote tonight as to how many Jews we're going to call an anti-Semite tonight.
Gideon, you're up.
I will be one of them, obviously.
Of course. You're Hamas too, Gideon, don't forget.
When David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel, he stretched out his hand to the Arab population and said, let us build this country together. And that war of annihilation was launched on Israel almost immediately.
And kicked out 600,000 Palestinians, and erased all the villages.
Well, let's deal with that point head on.
Natasha,
there has been...
in fairness of time and what's remained on the clock, just quickly wrap this up.
There's been a great deal of literature debunking those false claims, in particular a recent book on the myth of Deir Yassin, which I commend to the audience. And I think we're looking at a parallel issue here of history being subverted to promote a particular narrative that is not in keeping.
We appreciate that point. We're just going to. Mehdi, I know you want to respond to that, but I want you to also offer defense of international institutions at this moment as it relates to holding the State of Israel to account.
I have just one sentence to say about that, is that the entire world wants a ceasefire, and the United States and Israel and, I don't know, the Micronesia and whatever else don't, right? The entire world takes a very different view, unfortunately, to the people in this room and to Douglas and Natasha. The International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the UNHCR, UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, Christian Aid. Yep, you're booing. What does it come to when you're booing Oxfam? What does that tell you about yourselves? You're sitting here booing Oxfam to defend Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me just deal with something you just said. You talked about debunking propaganda. First of all, you can't even get Israeli propaganda straight. The Israeli government's own security agency, Shin Bet, investigated what you just said and said, no, we found no evidence that workers from Gaza were involved in the October 7th attack. Oh, Shin Bet alive. They're booing Shin Bet, the Israeli security service. Got it. All right, let me finish my point. You had a 5-minute speech from your side. Okay. That's Shin Bet. Let me just deal with your wider point here. Douglas and Natasha tonight want to make this entire debate about October 7th. I get it. It's a horror show. But that's not the debate. The debate was about Zionism, and it tells you a lot that they can't find any arguments to say, as Gideon says, why we can't be allowed to criticize a political ideology that is 150 years old, that many Jewish people have criticized from the beginning and continue to do so. They can't tell you why that is. So they focus on October the 7th, which is fine, but if you're going to focus on October 7th, then also focus on what happened since October the 7th, the erasure of Palestinians in this debate, the booing when Gideon mentions what happened to Palestinians. Shameful. I'm sorry to say it's absolutely shameful and telling about what's going on. And I would say this, if we're going to talk about October 7th and what happened since, everyone's a liar, the Hamas health ministry is like, everyone's a liar. Okay, friend of mine, American doctor, goes to Gaza. Many doctors have gone to Gaza. You've seen them on the news, they're all liars, all Hamas apparently. Friend of mine went to Gaza. He's been to Sudan. He doesn't just use it for whataboutism like Douglas. He's been to Sudan. He's been to Afghanistan. He's worked there. He came back from Gaza and said, I've never seen atrocities like I've seen here. What's happened to children? He's an anti-Semite because he saw children with burn wounds like he's never seen. He saw children with gunshot wounds to the head. To the head, but that's Hamas's fault. Everything is Hamas's fault. So let's talk about war crimes. It is amazing that every human rights group in the world, including Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem, Gisha, Yeshdin, are all documenting this stuff, but you guys think it's all imaginary. So again, it tells you about what Zionism is. This is not about some abstract ideology of, people trying to settle the land and trying to have it. But as Gideon said, there was an argument to be had in the 1940s, 30s, 20s. Zionism today is what the Palestinians are enduring on a daily, nightly basis in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Israel itself. And the erasure of that tells you everything about why we need to be able to talk about what Zionism does to the Palestinians without being smeared as anti-Semites.
Okay, Douglas?
First of all, again, you should do the reporting yourself, Mehdi. I've seen the maps on the bodies of the terrorists. I've seen, for instance, the one of the bodies of the terrorists.
Shin Bet is Hamas.
Well, no, you're just trying to make a cheap debating point again.
No, it's called a fact.
Let me
make
the point, which instead of you making your cheap debating point, is a fact which you should think of imbibing. Just stop it for a moment, Mehdi, and listen.
Please, go. Come on. Give us your facts.
I'll give you one example. The terrorists who came into Ofer-Kim, which is many miles from the border, on the bodies of the 12 terrorists who made it into that settlement, into that community there, in Ofer-Kim, I have seen the map on the body of at least one of the terrorists, and it had on the map the house of a member of the Knesset who lived there, the house where the synagogue was going to be because it was a holy day, and the kindergarten. Now, I'll give you one other example. In Near Oz, excuse me, because you lied again. Because you lied again and pretended that what Natasha just said was not the case. And I'm telling you
what Shin Bet says.
No, you're not, Mehdi.
As
usual, you're making a cheap point for your partisan reasons. And I am telling you,
You've accused me of being Hamas, but I'm the chief debater.
I have seen the precise maps of the communities I'm afraid I am.
I'm afraid
more reliable than you and your bosses in Qatar.
You're not, Douglas. Oh, my boss is in Qatar, not chief debating. Douglas, you're the guy. Let's just be clear. You're the guy who denied earlier that what you said in the Spectator. Let's just be the clear context. We're talking about October 7th, October 7th. 5 days after October 7th, you said maybe they will finally put an end to this insoluble nightmare, raise Hamas to the ground, or clear all the Palestinians from that benighted strip. It could be a good time to do it, but you tell this audience we can live in peace side by side. That's a war crime. No. Ethnic cleansing is a war crime. Not at all. Clearing people.
No, I said maybe for a reason.
It could be a good time to do it.
For goodness sake.
Douglas, just apologize and move on.
Brilliant.
Seriously.
Talking about moving on, we are now going to...
That is what we have heard advocated by the opposition today. And so I ask you, if you are, as Israel, liberal, care about peace, and abhor racism, you will stand with the proposition this evening.
Mehdi Hasan, let's have your closing.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we finish that, I do want to say, look, I get it. I do. I get it. Anti-Semitism is undeniably on the rise. Hate crimes are on the rise. Ancient tropes and conspiracy theories are back in circulation. No one is denying that. And so Jewish people, understandably, feel unsafe, threatened, insecure. So we should take a stand. I've said this for years. Take a stand against anti-Semitism, all of us. But this isn't it. This is not it. This motion is not it. I'm sorry to say, this motion is an attempt to play you, to manipulate you, to gaslight you by propagandists and apologists for Israel's current government. In fact, this motion could have been written by the Israeli government. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just back in 1973, Israel's own foreign minister, Abba Eban, said the quiet part out loud. It began over 50 years ago. He said, and I quote, "One of the chief tasks of any dialogue with the Gentile world is to prove that the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is not a distinction at all. Anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism," he said. So this attempt, there's nothing new about this attempt to define a new anti-Semitism, even while the old anti-Semitism from Douglas's end of the political spectrum is flourishing right now. We have a Republican presidential candidate who is a card-carrying anti-Semite who hosts Holocaust deniers for dinner, but we don't hear about that. We have far-right militias on the rise right now across North America. We don't hear about that. Just a few years ago, the biggest massacre of Jews in North American history took place in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, and the shooter was not a left-wing anti-Zionist, it was a right-wing anti-Semite. We didn't talk tonight in this debate about the anti-Semitic threat being posed by the rise of far-right parties in Europe, where the Israeli press says this is good for Israel. Wow, I remember a time when the rise of far-right parties wasn't good for Jewish people, but it's good for Israel and its right-wing government, for Ben Gvir, for Smotrich, for Netanyahu. We don't talk about the threat posed by Viktor Orban, openly anti-Semitic leader in Europe. If I wanted to make a cheap debating point, I'd say that's because he's a fan of Douglas and Douglas is a fan of his, but I won't make that cheap debating point. We don't talk about that stuff. And ladies and gentlemen, look, even if you ascribe the best of intentions to the proposition side tonight, and spoiler alert, I don't. This entire debate is a distraction, a deflection, an attempt to make you look over here, not over there. There being Gaza, where they don't get to have protests on college campuses because the most moral army in the world wiped out 12 college campuses in Gaza. There being the West Bank, where a record number of children have been killed since October the 7th, even though the West Bank is not run by Hamas. There being Israel, where a government of self-proclaimed fascists and racists faces nightly protests from thousands of Jewish Israelis, including the families of hostages. But no, don't look over there. Look over here. Embrace this pernicious idea that those of us who oppose the way in which Israel was created, or what Israel has become, or how Israel treats its Palestinian minority, we're all somehow bigots, racists, anti-Jewish, even the Jews among us, like Gideon. Because, remember, that is the motion tonight, not whether you support Israel or Zionism, which is fine, but whether the rest of us who don't are automatically anti-Semitic. By the way, what a weird and bizarre situation we find ourselves in tonight in Toronto, where we've had a British atheist of Christian descent, a non-Jew, telling the Jewish grandson of Holocaust victims who lives in Israel that he's an anti-Semite. What a bizarre debate. Tells you everything. Because he opposes the governing ideology of Israel. Think about how absurd that is. Think about how offensive that is. And then ask yourself the question, why would you vote for that? Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to vote against this flawed, false, and truly dangerous motion. Vote for free speech and common sense.